The news has been, well, intense lately, hasn't it? All dominated by reports of U.S. airstrikes on Iran.
Absolutely unavoidable.
So today, our goal is really to dig into what actually happened. The claims surrounding it, the global reactions, and, crucially, what lies ahead. We want you, our listener, to truly grasp the implications.
Hmm.
We'll be pulling insights from, well, a whole range of sources, breaking news, of course, but also detailed satellite image analysis, economic commentary, political takes, and really importantly, those on-the-ground reports from inside Iran and nearby.
Exactly. And this isn't about pushing just one perspective. It's about giving you that multifaceted view of what is clearly a rapidly evolving crisis. We'll explore the strategic thinking, the frankly audacious tactics used, and those ripple effects stretching all the way from Washington to Tehran and really far beyond.
Right. So as we unpack all this, the core question we're wrestling with is, did these strikes actually achieve what they said they would? Or have they maybe just ignited something even more dangerous? Let's start at the beginning. To really get this moment, we need a bit of context. These U.S. strikes, the ones making headlines everywhere, they came just 10 days after Israel launched its own attacks on Iran.
That's a key lead up, yeah.
Then we saw President Trump live on TV making a very direct announcement. He claimed, quote, spectacular military success.
Strong words.
Very strong. He declared Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated, called Iran the bully of the Middle East. And then a stark warning.
Yeah.
If they didn't make peace, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
And it's crucial, I think, to look at the specific targets.
Yeah.
The U.S. hit 3 key uranium enrichment sites: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Right.
Now, Fordo, that was particularly challenging for damage assessment because it's, built deep under mountains, shielded.
Heavily fortified.
Exactly.
Correct.
But we do have satellite images, the before and after shots, and they clearly show impact holes, concrete dust.
Yeah.
It indicates significant force was definitely used.
Okay. And Isfahan and Natanz.
Similar story for Isfahan. The before and after images show visual damage. With Natanz, though, the really critical question is, does Iran still have the material, the equipment, and, maybe most importantly, the scientists they need to rebuild? Or, potentially, to raise for a bomb? That's the big unknown.
That leads us straight into the how, doesn't it? The tactical execution. Can you shed some light on this Operation Midnight Hammer? It sounds, well, audacious.
Audacious is the right word. It's an incredible story of military planning and precision. We're talking more than 100 U.S. warplanes involved, including B-2 stealth bombers.
B-2s? Okay.
And picture this. These B-2s flew get this, 40-hour round trip.
40 hours?
Yeah, all the way from Missouri, right in the American heartland, carrying and delivering these enormous munitions.
Incredible logistics.
It really is. And the tactical details are fascinating. Apparently, one group of B-2s flew west, kind of like a decoy.
Okay.
While 7 others took the long way, flying east for 18 hours. Constant refueling, minimizing communications, basically trying to stay completely silent.
Wow.
Then, just before they hit Iranian airspace, a U.S. submarine launched more than 24 missiles at Isfahan. And right after that, the B-2s come in and drop 14 so-called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker buster bombs.
14 bunker busters. That sounds like a serious attempt to get through defenses like at Fordo.
Precisely. Designed to penetrate deeply buried targets.
So a complex multi-stage operation. But when we look at assessing the actual damage, did the results match President Trump's totally obliterated claim?
Well, that's where it gets a bit more nuanced. Well, President Trump made that very strong statement. The U.S. military's own initial assessment was slightly different. They indicated the facilities were severely damaged, but importantly not destroyed.
Okay, a significant difference there.
Significant difference. Although it's worth noting, a BBC Verify assessment looking at various sources concluded that all 3 sites sustained, quote, extremely severe damage and destruction. So, still very heavy impact.
Right. And what about the nuclear material itself? That's obviously a huge concern.
Absolutely. And here's a fascinating detail. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, reported no radiation leaking from the sites.
Which could mean?
Well, it raises a really important question. Was the nuclear material even there when the strikes hit? Some analysts point to satellite images taken just days before the attack, showing a large number of trucks near Fordo. Now, this is interpretation, but some suggest this could indicate Iran moved the uranium before the strikes landed.
Anticipating the attack, perhaps? That adds another layer of complexity.
It certainly does. Makes assessing the true impact on their program much harder.
Okay, so we've covered the strikes themselves, the targets, the operation, the immediate damage assessment. And let's broaden out. The crucial next step is understanding the diplomatic and political shockwaves. How have these strikes shifted the international chessboard? Are we seeing signs of de-escalation or the opposite?
That's the million-dollar question right now, isn't it?
Let's start with the U.S. stance, because honestly, it seems like there are some mixed messages coming out of Washington.
There really are. You had President Trump stating quite clearly, we are not at war with Iran, but rather with its nuclear program. He said they were trying not to topple the ruling regime.
Okay, trying to draw a distinction.
But then you have Vice President J.D. Vance explicitly saying, we are at war with Iran's nuclear program. A subtle but maybe important difference in phrasing.
Yeah, at war with the program sounds more direct.
And then Secretary of State Marco Rubio comes out saying it's time to get back to direct negotiations, adding that America would be ready to talk tomorrow. So military action followed immediately by an offer to talk.
Which Iran might see as coercive.
Potentially.
Huh.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon seemed keen for this whole operation to be, already over.
Yeah.
They were urging Iran not to respond, a sentiment Trump echoed with his one-and-done comment.
Right, one and done. Hit them hard, then stop.
But then, the president later posted on Truth Social, floating the idea of regime change if the current Iranian leadership can't, quote, make Iran great again.
Wow, okay, so that really muddies the waters from not trying to topple the regime to suggesting regime change.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult to figure out what the actual unified U.S. strategy is here. Is it containment, negotiation, or something more drastic?
Given that mix of signals, how is Iran likely reading this, and how have they reacted publicly to the strikes themselves?
Predictably, Iran's response has been furious, outraged, and defiant. Their foreign minister flatly denied the strikes caused a major blow, though the evidence suggests otherwise, and accused the U.S. of breaking international law.
Standard rhetoric, perhaps, but still strong.
Very. The Iranian president took a very firm line, saying Iran won't be bullied and that the U.S. must receive a response to its aggression.
A promise of retaliation.
Explicitly. And the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, went even further. They warned that U.S. military bases in the region are vulnerable.
That's a direct threat to U.S. personnel and assets.
Absolutely. And has led to serious talk of how they might retaliate. Firing whistles at U.S. bases, maybe in Iraq, Bahrain, or Qatar. Or the big one, closing the Strait of Hormuz, that strategically important sea passage.
Which would have massive global repercussions.
It's huge. We'll probably come back to that.
Okay. And the wider world. How's the international community reacting to this dangerous escalation? Are they lining up behind the U.S. or urging caution?
International concern is definitely running very high. The UN Security Council held an emergency session. They expressed deep concern about military escalation, warned against another cycle of destruction.
Calls for calm, essentially.
Yes, the Secretary General pleaded for dialogue. Leaders in Britain, France, Germany, the E3 urged Iran not to further destabilize the region, trying to contain it.
And powers like Russia and China?
Interestingly, both condemned the strikes, called them a breach of international law. They urged a return to diplomacy, not more fighting. But crucially, so far, neither Russia nor China has signaled any, direct support for Iran.
So condemnation of the U.S. action, but not necessarily backing for an Iranian response.
It seems that way for now. All eyes are now turning to that upcoming NATO summit in the Netherlands. That's going to be a critical meeting for Western leaders to coordinate, discuss next steps.
Right. And speaking of discussions, or lack thereof, these strikes ignited a pretty significant constitutional debate back in the U.S., didn't they? About Congress not being consulted.
Yes, a major point of contention. The fact that the U.S. Congress was not consulted before these strikes immediately drew fire.
From whom, mainly?
Particularly from Democrats. They claimed President Trump acted unconstitutionally, framed it as a war of choice, undertaken without any compelling national security interest, being demonstrated to Congress, and certainly without a proper debate and vote in Congress, authorizing military force against Iran.
Which ties into the broader debate about war powers.
Exactly. Now, connecting this back to the potential consequences, that threat we mentioned, Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
If they were to do that, it would have a truly huge economic impact. We're talking potentially serious economic consequences globally.
Remind us just how vital that strait is.
Okay, roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply flows through it. and about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG. And it's become even more vital for Europe since the war in Ukraine reduced Russian gas supplies.
So it's a global choke point.
A massive one. Closing it would be a powerful weapon in Iran's armory, a way to internationalize the crisis through the world economy. We already saw oil prices jump 9% just after the initial Israeli-Iranian missile exchanges. This would be far bigger.
A staggering economic risk. And how has the UK, a key U.S. ally, navigated this, especially given they weren't consulted beforehand either?
Yeah, the UK is in a really awkward spot here. Prime Minister Keir Starmer apparently had his phone call with President Trump after the attacks were already underway.
Not ideal for an ally.
Not ideal. The UK position seems to be they're willing the ends. They agree Iran shouldn't get nuclear weapons, but they are conspicuously not explicitly endorsing the means, meaning these specific American attacks.
A diplomatic tightrope walk.
Very much so. There were reports of concerns being raised privately in London about the legal basis for being involved. For example, if the U.S. used the Diego Garcia Air Base, which is British territory, was permission sought properly, etc.
Right, legal and logistical questions.
So the UK's public line remains focused on diplomacy, that diplomacy is the long-term path to a long-term solution. It highlights a clear difference in preferred approach compared to Washington's recent actions.
Okay, so immense external pressures, diplomatic maneuvering. But what about inside Iran? How is the nation itself coping? What does this mean for the regime's stability?
It seems like a nation really in flux. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is facing a huge choice. Does he sort of swallow his pride to try and save the regime from more damage, maybe even try to de-escalate, or does he feel compelled to fight on and risk everything?
A massive decision, and public opinion.
Reports describe it as divided and confused. You have some Iranians demanding a firm and decisive response, wanting to uphold national pride, Iranian identity. But others are calling for reflection and contemplation, perhaps fearing the consequences of more conflict.
And what are we hearing from the ground? You mentioned BBC Persian colleagues. What's the reality they're reporting? Is the regime managing to project strength?
It's a really nuanced picture they're painting. For instance, a state TV reporter went to Fordo and claimed not much damage, trying to counter the U.S. narrative. It becomes America's word against Iran's.
Right, the information war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But beneath that public messaging, the assessment from many observers is that the regime is actually seriously weakened and humiliated. They're struggling to maintain credibility and grip on power, especially given the widespread discontent that existed even before these strikes.
And are people reacting physically? Moving?
Yes, we're seeing compelling reports from Turkey's border with Iran. Movement in both directions, actually.
Both ways. Interesting.
Yeah. There's one account of Amir, a retired British-Iranian man. He fled Tehran, crossed the border into Turkey, and just felt immense relief. He described the situation back in Tehran as very, very scary, saying the sky belongs to the Israelis, reflecting the fear after those earlier Israeli strikes too.
Wow.
And he mentioned struggling to get out, finding the British embassy closed, staff apparently gone, which added to the sense of abandonment, I suppose.
Understandable. Was it a mass exodus?
The reports suggest it wasn't a flood of people, no. More like those who had the means to do so financially, logistically were getting out if they felt threatened.
That personal story really drives home the fear people must be feeling. How does this movement, these feelings, reflect the broader hopes and fears for Iran's future?
It really highlights that deep uncertainty. You hear younger Iranians, like a 13-year-old boy named Darish, expressing hope for a new Iran to somehow emerge from the ashes. He apparently said something like, God willing, Iran will be free soon, and hope the Islamic Republic will be gone.
So hope for fundamental change, even amidst the crisis.
Yes, but then you have the fear. Some people going back into Iran from Turkey were reportedly too afraid to even speak on camera. That tells you a lot about the atmosphere.
The real chilling effect.
Absolutely. And opinions on the regime's future are split. Some Iranians believe it will fall eventually, though they worry about a military takeover maybe replacing it. Others are more cynical, saying the leadership has hung on for decades through multiple crises, and they can probably hang on now.
Resilience versus fragility.
Right. But one fear seems common among many hoping for change. Just how many people might be killed in whatever transition might come, the human cost.
A deeply sobering thought. Okay, we've looked at the U.S., Iran, the world, but we can't forget Israel's role in all this. How were these U.S. strikes viewed in Jerusalem, and what's their ongoing part?
Israel's perspective is Absolutely critical here. It's important to remember, even after the major U.S. strikes, Iran apparently launched more missile strikes on Israel, aimed at Haifa and Tel Aviv, injuring, reports say, more than 80 people. So the direct conflict continued.
Right, it wasn't just a U.S.-Iran event.
Not at all. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's stance remains firm. He says Israel will keep going until it achieves its goals. And he seems to retain strong public support for the war within Israel.
And his view on the U.S. involvement.
He seems to see it very positively. He reportedly called America's intervention a turning point in the war, even a pivot of history that could lead to prosperity and peace in the region.
High-stakes rhetoric.
Very high stakes. And it's impossible to ignore the context here. Striking Iran has been a long-standing ambition for Benjamin Netanyahu. Sources say he has wanted to strike Iran for decades. This isn't a new idea for him.
Which raises questions about the lead-up, doesn't it? About the intelligence assessments that prompted this timing, especially regarding Iran's nuclear program.
That is a crucial point, because reports suggest that not all American intelligence agencies shared Israel's assessments that Iran had suddenly begun racing to build a nuclear weapon.
A divergence in intelligence between allies.
Apparently so, and that's significant. The danger, or at least the dynamic reveals, is potentially Netanyahu drawing in a U.S. President, Trump, who had consistently said he wanted to avoid getting entangled in more foreign wars.
So different intelligence interpretations might have driven actions with huge consequences.
It certainly highlights how differing assessments can shape events and complicate strategic goals in incredibly dangerous ways.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've covered a lot of ground. We have the U.S. seemingly aiming for a sharp, perhaps one-and-done military operation.
But sending mixed signals afterwards.
Right. Then you have Israel possibly seeing this as a turning point and pushing for continued pressure, maybe more action.
And Iran feeling weakened but defiant, vowing retaliation and holding that economic threat of the Strait of Hormuz.
And meanwhile, the rest of the world is largely urging de-escalation, pleading for dialogue, worried about the whole thing spiraling.
It really is an incredibly delicate and dangerous moment. You can see how easily a miscalculation, a misunderstanding, or just one more escalatory step from any side could lead to, well, disastrous consequences.
Consequences that would stretch far beyond the Middle East.
Absolutely. Which leads us to the final thought, perhaps. Given this really intricate web of motivations we've discussed, the conflicting claims, the different strategic goals, that palpable risk of miscalculation, how might this whole event reshape not just the Middle East, but maybe the broader international order?
Yeah.
What does this deep dive really suggest about how deterrence works or doesn't work today? And what are the limits of military intervention in a world that's so interconnected? It's certainly something for you, our listeners, to ponder long after we finish talking today.